Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Ben Gurin, and I'm the Assistant Manager of Events here at the Center for Jewish History. The center is home to the archival collections of 5 partner organizations, which together create the largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. I am pleased to welcome you today to this exciting talk with John Lahr about his newly released biography of the late playwright Arthur Miller, entitled Arthur Miller, American Witness. This is the latest title in the Jewish Live series, a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation. Jewish Lives is a prize-winning series of biographies designed to explore the many facets of Jewish identity, with individual volumes that illuminate Jewish figures from all fields and throughout history. John will be joined today in discussion by MacArthur Prize-winning playwright Sarah Ruhl. Before we begin, I'll just go over a few technical notes for our viewers. Firstly, the chat function for this webinar has been disabled, but you are welcome to submit questions for the author using the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. The Q&A portion of our program will take place after the discussion, but you can type your questions at any time. Secondly, this program is being recorded and will be available on the center's website and YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And anyone who registered for this webinar will be emailed a link to the recording as soon as it's available. Lastly, if you'd like to view the automated live captions and you're not currently seeing them, you can click on the CC button on the bottom of your screen. And now I will briefly introduce our speakers before I pass them the virtual mic. The author, John Lahr, has been a contributor to The New Yorker since 1991, where for 21 years he was its senior drama critic. He is the author of 19 books, including Tennessee Williams' Mad Pilgrimage of the Flesh, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Lahr is the first critic to win a Tony Award for co-authoring the play Elaine Stritch at Liberty. Our moderator, Sarah Ruhl, is a playwright, essayist, and poet. Her plays include In the Next Room, or The Vibrator Play, The Clean House, Passion Play, Dead Man's Cell Phone, Melancholy Play, For Peter Pan on Her 70th Birthday, The Oldest Boy, Stage Kiss, Dear Elizabeth, Eurydice, Orlando, Late, a Cowboy Song, and a translation of Three Sisters. She has been a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and a Tony Award nominee. Her plays have been produced on and off Broadway around the country and internationally, where they have been translated into over 15 languages. Ruhl received her MFA from Brown University, where she studied with Paula Vogel. She has received the Steinberg Award, the Sam French Award, the Susan Smith Blackburn Award, the Whiting Award, the Lilly Award, a Penn Award for Mid-Career Playwrights, and the MacArthur Award. John and Sarah, thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to hear this conversation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks for that nice introduction, and thank you for having me. I was delighted when John asked me to be part of this discussion. I loved this book. I found it so illuminating, and I really think theater criticism is a sort of dying art, and John is the best of the best and sees into a writer's body of work with such penetration and illumination and wisdom and compassion too. So I feel like I have a lot to learn from this book as a playwright and as a person interested in Arthur Miller and as a person interested in theater and as a citizen. So anyway, I'm excited to talk about it. And I guess my first question for you, John, is, was there anything that surprised you in the research? I mean, I know you probably knew a great deal about Miller going into it, but was there something you thought, I had no idea about this?
Well, Miller was boxed clever about his plays because he was a political playwright and he did write plays with the aspiration of changing the society's sense of itself. That said, what surprised me when I got into it and dug down deep into it, is how fascinating it was that he brought his own autobiography into the making of these these plays. It's not to say that he reproduced his life, but the real issues in his life that he was contending with, as Elia Kazan always said, where he was ambivalent. He created stories in which those problems make very disguised, make very vivid appearances, and really are dramatic or are intense because he's uncertain about the answers. When he becomes certain about the answers and likes to hear himself opine, which is one of the dilemmas of celebrity, then the plays become less exciting as drama, so that they sort of divide the ones that live because the moral quandary is alive in him, and the ones that are more like well-told essays. Anyway, I think the surprising thing is the difference between what he said about his childhood, to some degree, and the truth of it. The first thing that Miller said about his childhood, just in Time Bends, if you read Time Bends, which is a very, very good autobiography, long-winded but good, is that his father was a successful business clothier, made clothes. What he doesn't say is that his father ran probably one of the 2 or 3 biggest clothing operations in America. He oversaw 800 workers, and he was so successful that in the beginning of the around 1910, a sponger called William Fox from the garment district came to him and asked him for $50,000, which is the equivalent in today's money of about $1 million, to start a movie production company in Hollywood. And so Miller lost his chance. He does mention this in biography, to really be a Hollywood kid, and his father to have been a mogul of some sort. But the thing was that everything hinges in his internal life on one startling fact, which is this very big, handsome, genial, commanding man who Miller really idealized couldn't read or write. He was illiterate. And when he married a beautiful 17-year-old cum laude high school graduate who his name was Isidore and her name was Augusta. She was cultured, she had cultural expectations, she was in the family the reader, and the issue, when this is a phrase that comes through many of his plays, the families got together and brought their bank accounts, and they sat in a room, and they came out, and that's how the marriage was arranged. And she said, and this is a phrase that comes to in 2 or 3 of his plays, she said, "I was sold like a cow." And that was okay, but she didn't realize until they were, and Miller has dramatized this scene in The American Clock, among other places. She didn't realize until they were at a restaurant that when he handed her the menu and asked her to read it, that he couldn't read. So you can imagine the shock and the sort of fury and humiliation. And all of that was, to some degree, whitewashed by the fact that they lived an extremely lavish life, in the sense that the wedding had 250 people. I don't know about you, but my wedding had about 10. And not only that, they lived at the time that Miller was born, there were 14 million Jews in New York, and 200,000 of them lived in Harlem. And Miller writes in Time Bends that he didn't actually know any Gentile people growing up. But he lived on Central Park North, looking down over Central Park before there was gigantic skyscrapers. So he lived on the 6th floor, so he could see all the way down to the harbor. You know, they had a chauffeur, they had maids, they had pianos, they had a place on the beach. They took into Broadway shows, but actually they had no cultural conversation because he literally did not know anything but his business. So there was this patina of which is I'm familiar with, the patina of privilege, which, as it were, makes the surface of life apparently happy. But underneath that surface, there's all sorts of unconscious, roiling disappointments and contradictions that even as a child, you don't understand them, but you're picking them up. I mean, Miller wrote a very good short story called I Don't Need You Anymore, 1959 it was, about a 5-year-old dealing with he can't comprehend quite what's wrong, but he knows that something's wrong. That deals with an accosting unhappy mother and a person quite like his father, and an uneducated father. And this is the point, the masquerade of family unity. Now, Miller was the middle son. His older brother, Kermit, who figures large in Miller's internal world, Kermit was the star of the family. He was handsome. He was intellectual and intelligent. He is the one who he was a great athlete, and he was an idealist. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he believed in social reform, and he believed in loyalty. And Miller both envied him and naturally was competitive with him. So that was it. That was that ambivalence. And then not too long after, well, Miller was born in 1915. In 1920, the baby sister arrived. Now, as a biographer, I'm looking for. I sense that this is a toxic environment, and there are lots of indications that Miller felt, as he says, a little. He doesn't quite acknowledge it, but he does talk, feeling outside the family, feeling dispossessed, and the signals of this are in his early life that he's a sleepwalker. And that he says in Time Bends that 3 times a month he would consider running away from home. He said, I had my own sort of separate internal world. And the thing that interested me most about this internal world, with Tennessee Williams, he was a poet. But when he decided, he'd only seen 2 plays when he decided to write plays. And the reason was, he said people arrived in his imagination. They just arrived. Now that seems, to people who aren't writers or work or that makes sense to me. Now here, I wrote this down because I don't want to misstate the importance of this by sort of generally not quoting it correctly. But Miller had not the same, but a certain other dissociated experience of his family. And here's what he said. I had, it seemed, always existed on 2 planes at the same time. The actual reality and a metaphoric one, in which, for example, My father appeared as a de-animated and forbidding avenger who I knew was and was not my actual father. My mother was and was not the woman who was tempting me sensually to capture her from my father, and was both culpable of disloyalty to him and as herself perfectly innocent. And how that played out in the family is fascinating, because what tilted the family into real dark water was the stock market crash. And Isidore got caught trying to make more money playing the market than he was selling his cloaks. And so they lost. They went sort of bust. They had everything that they had, they lost. And as Isidore couldn't seem to bounce back, he sort of came home. He was very stoic. He would sleep a lot. But what the general feeling was, as things got worse, the contempt that the mother had for him got worse, to the point where Miller was aware of feeling incredibly sorry for the father under the circumstance. Now, given all that as a sort of preamble to the thing that is surprising, given how brilliant the best plays are, is that Miller was an absolutely sensationally terrible student. He was so bad that even in the Depression, he couldn't get into a university, could not get in. Now, his brother was at NYU, and things started. Miller says that, you know, when he tried to get in to the University of Michigan, was rejected. He worked. He went to night school. He faffed around for a couple of years, and then he wrote a cheeky letter saying, you know, you shouldn't have taken me last time, but now I'm here. Anyway, so he got into the University of Michigan, and he wrote. He decided to write a play because there was a playwriting competition, that if he won it, he would make enough money for his yearly scholarship. I mean, it would pay for his education. He didn't know, he'd only seen 2 plays, and the guy across the hall worked in the college dramat, and he actually asked him how long was an act, and so the guy said half an hour. So Miller set his alarm clock at a half an hour. And when that half an hour was up, that was the act. And it's a very interesting play. It's called No Victims, and it's absolutely about his family and the argument between the family, because the idealistic older brother says, he's not coming in the business. Let him get educated. Let him get out of here. And the mother is the seductive mother that he describes. She's projecting all of her frustrated cultural ambitions, all the people that she's now not going to meet, all the artistic events that she's now going to miss, all that's being projected into little Artie, who is, as Tennessee Williams is really a kind of co-production of his own ambition and his mother's ambition, for which he never quite forgives her, even though there's a certain amount of, you have to honor his incredible perseverance and lay that down to some degree to the success whisperer that his mother was. Been there, done there, got the anyway, so here's what happened.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is where everything, I know it's a bit long-winded, but where everything comes together is that he and his brother had a deal. And the deal was, Art, you go do a year, Then you come back and help Dad get back on his feet, and then I'll go back to NYU, and we'll go back and forth. We'll do it. We'll get through together. But after Arthur won the first prize, that first year, Arthur kind of welched on the deal.
Mhm.
He wanted to go back, and the brother, being the kind of self-sacrificing, people in the audience might say masochistic person that he was, said, okay, I'll work with Dad, etc. So that issue is what is played out entirely in Arthur Miller's last excellent play, The Price, which is absolutely autobiographical. The argument there is between his success and his brother's choice of duty and a life which is, as far as it's presented, a kind of half-life. He never realized his potential. As it happens, Kermit stayed with his father in a kind of indentured servitude because this is all very important, they were all told that the parents had no money. The war comes, Kermit goes to war, becomes a war hero, is wounded in the Battle of the Bulge, takes himself out of hospital to go back and fight, comes back completely traumatized and had a breakdown, to find that his parents, Izzy and Augusta, had lied to their boys that they actually had some money, that Kermit didn't have to surrender his life to the family.
Mhm.
And so that betrayal you'll find disguised in All My Sons.
Yeah.
In other words, in All My Sons, the premise of the war profiteering Kellers, by the way, in the original draft, the Kellers were called Ma and Pa.
Mhm.
The issue there is that the family, the lie leads to the death of the war profiteering leads to the death of many soldiers, and ultimately to their missing sons. It turns out he's committed suicide out of shame at his father and mother. Now, that's extends the idea socially into an area which Miller is very interested in, which I hope we'll talk about, which is his idea of individualism. But in his own personal story, there was also a death. It was that Kermit's life was sacrificed to this lie. So you can see how the synergy there. Anyway, so that spells out. That's a lot of what I discovered in terms of how this stuff slowly came into focus in his inner world. It didn't happen quickly.
I love this notion of his ambivalence that sort of disguised socially in his plays. And I love so much his essays about the common man and tragedy, and how he was trying to reframe tragedy for a contemporary audience, his contemporary audience. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, about this idea of the social up against the individual person.
Well, it's interesting because I live in London, where I'm talking to you from. And if you live out of the American culture, you realize that the word individualism, the idea of individualism, it has a completely other texture, meaning almost, to the European concept. And it particularly, Miller believed in that the self was defined by an interaction with society, with the group, just as you would say as a mom, a child is two people. You
Mhm.
know, it's you and the child reflecting back. And then you might say it's the same thing writ large with what Miller was saying, that there is, in America, the destiny of me is more reflected in the sort of solipsism of like Williams,
Mhm.
where and it's the kind of theater that, although he ended up writing a little bit in After the Fall like this, he abhorred. He wasn't interested in character, but only character in relation to how society shapes it, and how once we understand how society shapes the self, we might do something to change that interaction.
Mhm.
And the thing, it's interesting that his great plays, as Williams, come at a very specific time. Between 1945 and 1955 was the greatest rise in per capita wealth in the history of Western civilization. I mean, it tripled, nearly tripled. And his plays are, as what that did after a decade of the Depression and 4 years of war, America and Americans were released into a boom economy with the clear demand to pursue their own happiness. But what did that mean? And the happiness, in terms of Williams, that's desire. That's in a sense of surrendering himself to God. It's making a God of the self.
Mhm.
As in his, the mad pilgrimage of the flesh. It's all spiritualizing. It's very romantic, conventional in a way, but fresh to our moment. And Miller is in each of his plays really trying to look at the manifestation of different aspects of the manifestation of the idea of the self in the culture. And what the Kellers represent is just what we were talking about, people who only think of their own self-interest, their freedom. They're essentially Trump firsters.
Mhm.
And they don't see a connection to the community. And what they do, and what they're finally, the penny that finally drops, is that they have broken the social contract. They have not understood the relation of the self to the community. And that's what the son, who finally gets through to his father, and is the reason why the father kills himself, which is, maybe in the 40s. It's a little precipitous perhaps, but the point he's trying to dramatize isn't that. He's trying to dramatize, and he felt very strongly about this. He didn't want to talk about the forgetfulness in the culture, the sin of doing what these people have done. He wanted to show the process of denial which allows them to forget, to forget their history, to forget their allegiance to other people. And it's interesting because I was looking at it today. It's one of the plays I thought I sort of was lower in my estimate, but after writing the book, I think it's quite extraordinarily good play.
Mhm.
It was the last play he had so many failures that it was the last play he was going to write before giving up the theater, because he'd been working 9 years with very little success, making a living, but not getting the play on. And the last words, which are just amazing, are the mother, who is the source, who's the real. The mother will not allow anything. She insists that her son, who's been absent for 3 years, is coming home. And if you've been around people with whom you have to walk on eggshells, you can't. The play presents her as caring, and kind and a family woman, but she aggressively refuses to allow anybody to raise any issues about the source of people dying, the son. And so what she's doing there is aggressively attacking the mental space of all around her. And that's fascinating to me. Nothing can be spoken of. So the last words, her husband has killed himself, her son is leaving. She's learned that he died. Her other son died, committed suicide, and her words, which are the last words of the play, are "Forget now, live." And I think, oh my God, that's such a brilliant line. It could be out of Chekhov, because everything before has shown you the dynamic, which is what we're living through now. It's as present as voter fraud, or
Yeah, that's one question I was going to ask you actually is, if Miller were alive now, what do you think he would be saying about current?
I think he'd be saying what we're saying, but he's been writing about that. I mean, that's to some large extent also, I think, what he was trying to do in the Crucible, which was not to sort of draw the obvious parallel between House Un-American Activities Committee and these theologians and people calling other people out, but to dramatize a process which, for lack of a better word, is like violent innocence, where the crime is projected into the other. And that's what drives people crazy. The person who is, for instance, talking about voter fraud is the person who's defrauding the culture. And you in other words, it makes thought impossible. And that's what it's meant to do. It freezes rational discourse and it drives people crazy. And I think that is where the play accumulates this wonderful, insane, claustrophobic power, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about Marilyn Monroe, as long as we're talking about the Crucible, and just in general, Marilyn Monroe's effect on Arthur Miller's life and work as you see it?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you. It's a good question. I hope this is not a long-winded answer, but I will tell you. Sometimes biographers get lucky. And I got to know, and he knew my work and trusted me, Kermit's son, who was a professor of English, Ross Miller, who passed along a letter that Arthur wrote to his parents in May 6, 1956, explaining to them both the state of his marriage and why he had fallen in love with Marilyn Monroe. And it's eye-opening for a number of reasons. First of all, the Crucible is dedicated to Mary Slattery, his first wife. And keep that in mind, because it is absolutely true that Abigail is definitely the idea of sexual fecundity that he had in mind.
And temptation.
That's sort of what I meant. But that's my misspeaking.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought what I'd do is I'd read you. I remember I might have showed you this when we had.
Yes, please. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, this is stuff that he's it's interesting to me to read this. This is when he was in the divorce proceedings. He was getting divorced from Mary. But this is stuff that he's talking straight to his parents from his heart. He's not, you don't read this in time bends. where it's artfully, but not honestly stated. The turmoil he was in. So here's what he's going to, it's a little long, but he says, for me, Mary was a vindictive, punishing woman. I was not overstating things when I told you that had I not made the break, that is, decided to leave her, I would have sought another way than writing to make a living. That tells you the degree of despair that he was in. I cannot write when I am full of hate and surrounded by hate. The hatred in her head, which he has had for years, is now taking the form of this nonsensical warfare. She is trying to cripple me, as she has for years now, but I won't be crippled. On the contrary, I feel better, I am working better, and my writing is sharper and happier than it has been since I wrote Salesman, which was the last year of my happiness. So that is the sort of terrific turmoil he was in. Now, in the letter, he shifts to describing Marilyn, which is also a revelation, given all the mythology around her. I saw her 3 or 4 days in Hollywood over a period of 3 days, but never alone for 5 minutes, as I have said. Although Mary believed this and is incapable of believing this. This is just like Proctor and Elizabeth. Yeah. Absolutely. And he goes on to say, I had certainly never heard of her. Everyone else apparently thought she was a sexy dame. To me, she had a face bathed in tears, was scared to death, and could barely talk above a whisper. For reasons I have never understood, I told her what I thought, which was that she would be a great star and that she would make a great actress. She came to New York last winter. That was in 1951. So she came to New York last winter in 1955. And I still did not see her because I was going to hold on to the bitter end and beyond. This is the last sentence. But I could not write anymore. Bridge was written out of desperation. View from the Bridge was written out of desperation. I wrote it with my teeth clenched. My house was a tomb. Now, not only does that echo the Crucible, but I'm really interested in terms of the legend, because it's true, as Kazan said of Monroe, that she went for the drug of reassurance. But it's also true that it was a transactional situation, because Miller really felt that she was, because she was charming and beautiful and obviously sexually available, and that she was just inspiring him with life and vigor. And they were going to, and this is so interesting to me. They were in some way saving each other. They both saw each other as their kind of salvation. You know, if I'm so dumb, she said at one point, why would Arthur Miller marry? Do you know what I mean? There was all that going on. But this letter tells me something else. He didn't know her. He says in the letter, I plan to marry her someday. That's in May. In June, he married her. And the big shock for Miller was that when he'd never seen her act on the set. And she was an entirely different person on the set. She was beset by fear. She was arrogant. This was the first film from her own production company. And she behaved terribly, and Miller was shocked. And he left a diary. And I'm always suspicious when you see this in life.
Mhm.
It happened to Joe Wharton too, in the Wharton's diary with Kenneth Hallowell. That that diary happened to be open? Was he trying to tell her something that he didn't want to actually face her with? But in any case, he said essentially, no one has the access to those diaries yet. But she has said that he said he was disappointed in me and he may have made a mistake. That was 4 months into the marriage, of which he said 2 years were good and the rest were terrible. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, because as when Miller became Arthur Miller and not Art Miller, after Death of a Salesman, he really became a kind of household god. He was America's public intellectual. He's handsome, Lincoln-esque. It absolutely took in some sense, heroic stands. I think it's quite interesting that he chose to announce that he was getting married to Marilyn Monroe at the end of his House Un-American Activities. I would say debate, his appearance. So it may have been accidental, but it also may have taken a little of the odor on the headlines away from something else.
One question I have, just because we're doing this talk at Center for Jewish History, is do you have thoughts about his relationship to Judaism, to that history and community?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you there, Sarah, a bit, because although he used, I think he did have, he had strong feelings about it. He wrote it's generally thought that Gentleman's Agreement is the first novel about anti-Semitism in America. It's not. Miller's first successful book was Focus, which sold 90,000 copies and gave him the confidence to go back and try to write another play. So he experienced it. He felt it. He could also pass as a handsome, tall, not apparently necessarily clearly Jewish in terms of the general outline of what that's thought to be. But I think I don't think in what I've read that it comes much into his discussion. It was the aroma of his early life. It was the aroma of his humor, as you know from The Price. I mean, he could do all that tumbling, and in Broken Glass, which is, he uses Kristallnacht as a sort of metaphor. The woman, the wife, is paralyzed by over-identifying with Jewish suffering, and the husband is a Jewish-hated Jew who works in a bank, and it's an examination of the aridity of their life. But I don't think, as far as I'm aware, that he addressed it in any artistic way. Although I'm happily, I could be corrected on that.
Well, it's an interesting omission in its way.
Well, you've got to remember that one of the problems that he had and playwrights all had getting on, because Broadway was the only place that you could get a play on back in the day. And his letters to his teacher in Michigan, Kenneth Rowe, and his struggle, they didn't want Jewish plays. I mean, Odets had that problem, although he wrote the great Jewish Awake and Sing. The subsequent plays get, forgive me, Jew-washed in the sense that they wanted that light. They didn't want the ethnic thing. They wanted they thought that did not please the paying customers. And so that there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you would think that people would say that Willy Loman was, now we know, I mean, I think it would be fair to argue that those rhythms can only be, those are the rhythms of the speech and the attitudes are Jewish, but Willer would never admit to that. You know, so I think, again, I think he boxed clever because of the nature of what Broadway was at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I know we're supposed to open it up to questions around this time. So I have plenty more questions for you, but I just want to invite the audience to put any questions you have in the chat. You mentioned self-doubt, John, and you know, the idea that at a point he wrote Focus to kind of gear up to write the next play when he'd gone through a period of disappointment. Do you think that was the critical reception to his work? What do you think that was about?
Oh, he had a terrible production of a play called The Man Who Had All the Luck. It got on Broadway, but it was miscast and misdirected. And he couldn't see the point. And he writes to his professor, Kenneth Rowe, all by way, these letters can be accessed and read if anybody's interested. They're at the University of Michigan. That, you know, he just couldn't continue to spend a year or two of a very interesting life doing plays that aren't going to get done. So he just put it away and he made a living writing radio dramas, which he could do easily and were well paid. But he wasn't doing what he wanted to do. And he really wanted to write Broadway plays. He didn't really want to write. He had a couple of opportunities to write screenplays. And although he did win in the end the Academy Award for his adaptation of The Crucible. I know this is anathema, and I'm sure some of your viewers would disagree. I don't think he's a very good screenwriter. I don't think he writes very well for the screen. I think he writes very well for the stage. But it's all, to my ear anyway, a little clunky.
Sorry, I was on mute by mistake. And one other question I had for you about his life was, I divide in a way, when I think about Miller's autobiography and his work, I divide them partly into before and after Marilyn, but also before and after he had to, or felt, the family felt they had to put his son Daniel in a home. Daniel had Down syndrome, and he never mentions it publicly, and it sort of only came out later. And I think for a man who had such a public face of morality, I think it must have cost him a great deal. And I wonder if after that point, if he was able to write about morality in the same way in his work. And I just wonder what you made of that.
Well, at the time this came out, there was a kind of ecstasy of sanctimony about how terrible this was. But as someone who has had to face similar options in my own life, I think it's very, very hard to make a judgment unless you've been in it. If you think about the life that he had, the standard medical advice at the time was to simply give the baby up at birth and not bring it home, because the effects, in Miller's case, both of the parents were artists who were in the middle of their very big careers, and they had a healthy daughter, and to intrude this very time-consuming issue and problem I would have thought would have really undermined the family that existed. So it's a pragmatic call. What I think, and I do know that Miller included Daniel in his will, and I do know that Rebecca, his sister, has made a place for him in the family circle. So that what I think is hard to understand, but you may have answered it. I mean, Miller was the apple of his own eye. There's no doubt about it. And so I think it does. Why wouldn't he admit that? Because I think he would have had to admit it. A kind of, we don't know. I know that there was Down syndrome in his family tree. We don't know why he did that, but it certainly raises questions. I think that if you take a high moral position in public policy, you can be really vulnerable to your private vulnerabilities and failures.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think if just stay on this subject, I do think that there were two traumas in Miller's life. The first trauma was the Depression, and seeing which he thought was not only an economic catastrophe but a moral one, and that he never, to see his father languish, to see no leadership at home or in the society, was unconscionable. But the other trauma was definitely Marilyn. He could never understand how he was very heavily invested in being good. He couldn't understand how he couldn't reach her. He couldn't what she called the terror beyond terror. He'd never seen that. He didn't know how to cope with it. And he had promised her to write her a great part, to make her a great actress. And what he did, and it was the final thing, at the end of the Misfits, when she left the set, she left him. That was it. That was when they got divorced. But what was so disappointing to her, and part of her contempt for Miller, was that he promised to write her a great part, and what he wrote and what he trapped her in was his idealization of her when they first met. And him, there's a very interesting letter that he writes to Billy Wilder when he was trying to get Billy Wilder to do the film. And he is the outline of Gay, Clark Gable part. So he says, and this is the solution for Gay is to assert his skill, his craft, as well to earn money of his own instead of living off hers. He conceives the Mustang hunt to win her back, to dominate her, to bedazzle her, to assert his strength before her again, and thus to conquer and dispel her uneasiness and its threat of dismissal for him. So there you go. That's what the screenplay is, in a sense. That's the Mustang. The screenplay is.
That's amazing. We have a couple of comments and questions. This from Maddie, who says he was a roommate of Norman Mailer's, a writer who abused women, and they competed for Marilyn to date. I believe the quote, Mailer said she was heavy lifting, meaning stupid, like a dumb blonde. However, Lombard, Harlow were brilliant predecessors that Marilyn adopted, introducing humor. He used her in his announcement of the marriage publicly to enable them to leave on the honeymoon abroad and tamper down the HUAC hearing, which the Crucible is about.
What's his question?
I think this is more of a comment. Let's see. Yeah, then a
Well, I
question.
could just answer the part.
Yeah.
Kazan said a very good thing. She had no knowledge except knowledge of her own experience, which is all you need as an actress. She was a great actress. She was absolutely outstanding. I mean, and the point about Mailer, I'm very confused about. He wrote a very good book about him, but about her and him. But I don't quite understand why yes, we know what he did he was a sort of toxic male. But I mean, I don't know what the point there is.
I didn't know he was a roommate of Norman Mailer. That's interesting.
He wasn't.
They all lived in my neighborhood at some point. It says
he was a neighbor. He
right.
wasn't a roommate. They lived in Brooklyn.
Right, Brooklyn Heights. From Millie, can you talk about his attraction to communism and the consequences of the HUAC committee?
Well, yes. First of all, he wasn't a card-carrying communist, but he certainly his brother was a communist, and he certainly affiliated with very left-wing organizations and was very active, progressive. The House Un-American Activities Committee that we're talking about actually didn't discover one communist, but it was you could say it was like a parole board. You got in front of it, you told them your story, and they let you, if you told them your story, they would sort of publicly pat you or pat you on the hand and let you go. His problem when the problem with Kazan, which is quite complicated, it's much more complicated than the general newspaper stories let on. Kazan, by the time, Kazan was the only director who was a star in films and a star on Broadway, but he had decided that his career, having directed the three most important mid-century plays, Skin of Our Teeth, Streetcar Named Desire, and Death of a Salesman, he wanted to move entirely into film. And he had, when he was an actor in the group theater, he had joined the Communist Party and left it 18 months after he joined, because it was his experience in the group theater that communists had infiltrated it and were trying to infect shape the theater in a certain ideological direction. And he wanted nothing to do with that. So he was faced with a really interesting problem, which was, why should he surrender his career to something that he didn't believe? And when he and Miller writes, both Kazan and Miller write about this at length in both of their autobiographies. And Kazan's book, I recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, which is, I think, the great American theater book. It's just called A Life. Miller admits that he could see Kazan's point. He didn't automatically then disagree. Kazan testified twice, once behind closed doors, but he was told either he had to name names or he would never work in Hollywood again. And that's what Miller took issue with Kazan was, he thought that choice showed a lack of courage. Now you could, if you wanted to equate that with saying the lack of courage and not embracing your Down syndrome son. I mean, where do you, there's, I mean, that's the debate, but I think it's hard. Everybody is so righteous about this, but if you're faced with that situation, especially when you look at what Kazan ultimately gave to the American culture in terms of his own artistic expression, I think it's debatable. You know, I don't know that. Anyway, certainly they did work again. They did mend their fences to a degree with After the Fall, but of course, after you've been ostracized and the relationship, which was crucial to Miller at the time of his creative heights, you know, was never the same.
Can you talk for a second about, I love how you do such deep dives in your biographies, you know, Williams and Miller and others, and thinking about what you said about Williams as kind of a poet or someone for whom character just arrives versus Miller as kind of a builder and a craftsperson. I was interested to see in a documentary about Miller by his daughter, he was sort of building a house and talking about writing plays as kind of structural and a kind of building, like the WRIGHT of playwriting. And
well, also his first of all, he's a very good carpenter.
Mhm.
And when I knew Miller a bit, I met him first at the deathbed of Harold Clurman, who was my mentor. And then I met him for a New Yorker piece on the 50th anniversary. And I went up to Roxbury and he took me to the place, to the little hut that he built. And he took Inga with him. They'd been married 20 years. She'd never seen it.
Mhm.
So we went there, and it's sort of amazing that he took, I don't know, he took 2 or 3 weeks to build the house. And the thing that was amazing was that when the house was finished, with his tools still in the corner, he sat down and he wrote the first act of Death of a Salesman in 8 hours.
8 hours.
You're a playwright. How easy is that?
Wow. Mhm.
So in other words, he released the play. It was a brainstorm,
Mhm.
and it was extraordinary. And I think his carpentry, the thing about carpentry is, and it's like his playwriting, which makes, when it's great, it's wonderful. It's precise. It's thought out. It's beautifully finished. And he always said it's like putting something new in the world. That there was some thrill of just something was going to come out of this that wasn't there before. And that construction, whether it's a play or a table, there was a sort of wonder in it for him. And you could feel that in his talking about that, his interest in it. And you have to admire his resoluteness, which is, hard to sustain, because after The Price, which was in 1967, he was not, he and Williams, but I think in a way, it was more, it drove Williams kind of insane, but to Arthur, who was lionized to such a degree and such a public figure, he never, he was written off into the 21st century. So much so that when The Price was revived in the late 90s, the Times didn't even review it on the theater page. They reviewed it on the home page.
Wow.
I know it's the humiliation that these great writers have to contend with the sort of the caprice of taste or contemporary. It's just what happens. You just have to contend with it. But it's he did keep going. He did write his plays, and he certainly kept busy. And he never stopped making meaning.
Well, and I think in American theater, we don't like longevity or duration. And I think in the world of novels, American taste can bear it more, can kind of see a writer developing over time more than we do in the theater. But
Do you have any answer for that?
Why that is?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like we should convene another panel on that, because it's such an interesting question.
I think it happens in every sphere. I think critics can be really good they can really be on the moment when they're surfing the zeitgeist and they're young, and like Tynan, say, in the late 50s. He was really great for like 5 or 6 years. He was always a great writer. But when he starts to get, when sort of Pinter starts and Orton start arriving, he's still elegantly talking about them, but you feel that he's sort of groping for some way to make sense of it. So the times change for the critics. They certainly change for comedians. I've said that with my father, that, you know, you can't, what is funny to one generation, I mean, it just will not play. I mean, the tastes change, values change. You can't now in this culture, you can't say things, which is the job description of a comedian, as far as I'm concerned. So
I mean, in terms of what you're saying, and I should wrap it up soon, but the overlap between literature and theater, there's an overlap, but theater is also show business and comedy, and I think that has a shorter shelf life. And so bringing it back to literature, I think this book is a great contribution to literature and to literary practice, and also to looking at a body of work like Miller's that's cast such a towering figure, and that in his own lifetime at the end of it wasn't fully appreciated, but I think, you know, will be in the next 100 years, certainly. Is there anything you want to add as we sort of?
Well, I just want to say that in England, unlike America, he has never gone out of fashion, for the simple reason that the English understand the, for lack of a better word, the political position he's taking about society, the Marxist position. You know, they understand that that's what they live with. They live in a social democracy. Right. So he is consistently voted the most important playwright in England. So weird. And, you know, he can't get really discussed. Well, he is getting discussed, but what I mean is these things are swings and roundabouts, you know. Of course he's discussed, and every time there's a major production, I just saw one of the Crucible, you just are reminded of how beautifully built the piece is, and how it speaks to our moment as much as
the Crucible in London.
Yeah.
I have my own little issue with the Crucible in terms of Abigail / Marilyn, but I wrote my comic rebuttal in the play.
In your play, you
the
put
play
it in,
that I have on at Lincoln Center right now.
I know you put it in the postscript or the.
Yes, exactly, but there's no argument.
This is another discussion, but I would love to have it with you over the tea or another Zoom, because I still would take issue with you on that, but still.
Well, that's why we are longtime friends, because we can disagree publicly or privately and keep talking, unlike
well,
the world right now.
Nothing like talking to a smart person. Lovely.
Well, indeed. Everyone go buy Arthur Miller, John's biography for Christmas or Hanukkah, or
it's really a critical biography. It's not, you know, the nuts and the hoofs and the ears and the tail. It's the work and the man.
It's bizarrely a page turner, though, I have to say.
Well, how nice you are.
Well, thank you both so much for this discussion. I loved hearing all of your insights. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today. Thank you everyone who attended and everyone who submitted your thoughtful questions. As Sarah was saying, you can purchase your copy of Arthur Miller, American Witness by using the link and the promo code that were emailed to you when you registered, or through any of the websites that are listed in the chat. And to check out our upcoming programs, join our mailing list, or make a donation, be sure to visit us at cjh.org. And Sarah and John, I hope to see you for the next program that you were just devising for us.
Yeah, so it'll be a little hotter, I think.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
God bless. Have a Merry Christmas.